All right. Hey, everyone. So today on this slide in your PowerPoint for cellular respiration part 2, we're going to go over the steps of cellular respiration. But before we get there, we do need to review what some of the parts are that are on the board behind me. So on the board here, I drew a giant cell. That is these black outer circles represent. So that is our cell membrane. And then within the cell, I labeled the fluid. So before we called the fluid cytoplasm. Its technical name is the cytosol. So I included that in this picture because the first part of cellular respiration actually occurs in the cytosol. The second thing I drew is a mitochondria. Okay, we all know that as the powerhouse of the cell, and this process will help explain why that statement is so well known amongst people. So remember that the mitochondria has two membranes. It has this outer membrane, which I didn't label because it doesn't really have an important function, but I put it in purple, so that's our outer membrane. And then the inner membrane is all of this squiggly stuff inside of the outer membrane. And the reason that the inner membrane is kind of folded in on itself is to provide the mitochondria with enough surface area to do what it needs to do, which is make energy. Think of it if we had a really long piece of string that stretched out from one end of the room to the other. But I asked you to somehow make that piece of string fit in an area about this big. You would start folding your string from one end to the other, kind of folding it until it started to shrink enough to fit in this size. And that is what's happening with the inner membrane here. Okay. The blue stuff within the inner membrane is called the matrix. And the matrix is important because that is where our second step of cellular respiration happens. On the bottom down here, I wrote what the chemical equation is for cellular respiration. So I have oxygen here drawn in a little cloud to represent a gas. I have glucose, water, carbon dioxide, and ATP, which is the cellular form of energy. Okay, so to start, cellular respiration happens in 3 steps, and these 3 steps are going to be, they're way more complicated and more complex than what we are going to go over. But it does happen in a series of steps, and within those steps are even more smaller steps yet. So we're just going to kind of go over the process very general or as a whole. In order for this to happen, you need 2 things. In order for cellular respiration to occur, the first thing we need is glucose. So I'm going to draw a little glucose molecule up here. And remember, they are little hexagons. And I'm just going to put a G in there for glucose instead of writing glucose. And the second thing we need is oxygen. So I'm going to draw some oxygen up here also. Okay, so how do we get these things? Well, we breathe in oxygen and we eat food. Okay, and some of our food contains glucose or sugar, which is what is used in this process. Okay, so the first thing that has to happen is right now, glucose and oxygen are outside of the cell. They need to enter the cell by going through the cell membrane. And hopefully you remember diffusion. That was our 3rd unit. So they enter the membrane through diffusion. So I'm just going to draw arrows to represent that. Okay, so glucose is going to enter, and oxygen is going to enter the cell. I'm going to draw my little oxygen bubble again. And there's my glucose molecule. Okay, so now I'm going to focus on what happens with glucose. Oxygen we will need later on. Okay, so the first step in the cytosol, the first step is called glycolysis. So I'm going to write that. Actually, I'll write it in black. The first step is called glycolysis. Okay, that's kind of a big word, and if you don't know what it means, it might scare you. Okay, but if we break it down, the first part of that word, glyco, sounds like gluco or glucose, and lysis means to burst or to break. So in glycolysis, glucose is going to break down into multiple parts. So to represent that on the board here, I'm going to draw a glucose molecule kind of broken up here. Kind of looks like a little Pac-Man. Okay. When it's broken down into these two parts, it is called pyruvic acid. Okay, so far glucose has entered the cell, oxygen has entered the cell. Glucose, when it comes into contact with this liquid or the fluid, it breaks into two pieces called pyruvic acid. Okay, don't worry about the spelling on that. It's actually on the next slide. Okay, so that is all step number 1. Then what happens is step number 2 over here in the matrix of the mitochondria. And step number 2 is called the Krebs cycle. Okay, called the Krebs cycle after the guy who discovered this. What happens is these two pyruvic molecules or pyruvic acid molecules are going to come over here and enter the matrix of the mitochondria. So again, I'm just going to draw some arrows to show the movement of these molecules. Okay, so they are going to enter the matrix. And what happens in here, again, so the matrix is a fluid, it's a liquid, and when pyruvic acid comes into contact with it, these pyruvic acid molecules are going to be broken down even more into two parts. Okay, and those two parts, it breaks down into carbon dioxide. Hopefully you can see that. Drew it in orange. Okay, it breaks down into carbon dioxide and electrons. And electrons, I'm just going to write with a little e with a negative sign because electrons have a negative charge on them. You learned that in chemistry. Okay, so step 2, Krebs cycle, it has way more steps in that. It goes through a bunch of series of chemical reactions, but carbon dioxide and electrons are produced in the Krebs cycle. Okay. Step number 3 is called the electron transport chain. And we abbreviate that as ETC for short. In this step, we need a few things. So the oxygen that we kind of forgot about over in step 1 is needed in our step 3 here. Okay, so our oxygen molecule, instead of drawing arrows, we can draw an arrow. Our oxygen molecule comes in and it interacts with the inner membrane. So this inner purple part is where our step 3 is happening. Okay, and on this membrane, there are a ton of different proteins and little pumps that help convert these molecules into energy for us. Okay, oxygen is needed here as well as these electrons. Okay, so the electrons are also going to land on the inner membrane of the mitochondria. Now, what happens here, like I said, is a super duper complex process that we don't need to go into much detail about. All I need you to know is that when oxygen and the electrons come into contact with the inner membrane, all of these chemical reactions happen and they produce two things. Okay? They produce water and ATP. Okay, so I'm going to kind of recap what happened here, and then we're going to go through the equation together, the chemical equation. So step one of cellular respiration, oxygen and glucose have to enter the cell. Once they come into contact with the cytosol, glucose is broken down into two pieces, right? 1, 2, called pyruvic acid. Next, step 2 is the Krebs cycle. Okay, so the pyruvic acid molecules enter the matrix, and they produce, or that series of chemical reactions in the matrix, remember pyruvic acid is broken down even more yet, produces carbon dioxide, which we breathe out, right? So carbon dioxide is then released. It goes bye-bye. We don't need it anymore. And it produces electrons. Okay? Electrons have a negative charge, which is what this minus sign is showing you. The next thing that happens, these electrons and the oxygen that initially entered our cell goes into the inner membrane, so this inner purple part, for our step 3, which is the electron transport chain. And it's a chain for a reason. There's a series of proteins within the cell membrane that help these electrons and oxygen molecules kind of move along in sort of a domino effect. Okay? And that domino effect creates so many chemical reactions that our products of step number 3 are water, okay, which our body uses for different chemical reactions, and any extra water, hopefully you all know what we do with that. We pee it out. And ATP, remember ATP is our cell's form of energy. And in this step, that is where the majority of our energy comes from. It actually produces 36 molecules of ATP, which can be used for various things such as making DNA or making organelles, repairing the cell, fighting off diseases. Okay, all of that comes from the electron transport chain. So if we write the chemical equation, okay, there's our chemical equation for cellular respiration. Glucose and oxygen are needed, which happen in step 1, and we produce water, carbon dioxide, and energy. And you should hopefully know that this is the reverse process of photosynthesis. Okay, I think that has covered everything. On the next slide in the presentation is this kind of broken down for you into the things that you absolutely need to know. So make sure you take a look at that and don't skip it.